Player Profiler Posse. I am Hilo, and this is First Mover. Welcome back, friends. We are back for another episode of First Mover, and we spent the first 4 weeks together exploring human psychology in best ball. But we are now 4 Mondays until the opening of the regular season. And we've got pricing on DraftKings for DFS for week 1. So we're going to shift gears and we're going to start doing what we're going to be doing once we hit the regular season here on First Mover. And we're going to look at initial player pricing. And we've got 4 Mondays left. We've got 4 primary positions over on DraftKings. So we're going to spend a week each at quarterback, running back, wide receiver, and tight end. We're going to look at player pricing. We're going to look at overall game environments, and we're going to have some fun diving into the week 1 DraftKings player pricing here on First Mover. But before we jump into that, here's a quick word from the Podfather about Underdog.
Let's take a moment to talk about Underdog Fantasy. Now, many of you have already signed up. Thousands have signed up from Player Profiler already over the years. Underdog has supported us since 2020. Much of what you see on Player Profiler is because of Underdog, because of their support. Get the Underdog app, plug in that promo code Underworld. I used to play Underdog just for the best ball drafts. I mean, the best ball drafts are amazing. These draft rooms fill so quickly, and you can win life-changing money. You want to take advantage of all the sleepers we talk about on this show? Well, what better place than in an Underdog draft room to do that? And I recommend taking your Underdog play to the next level by diving into their NFL pick'ems. It's important to correlate those NFL pick'ems. You can pick both the quarterbacks and the wide receivers to exceed expectations. Correlate them, and you can 5x your payout. Bada bing, bada boom. Underdog Fantasy, the promo code is Underworld. For an instant deposit match up to $100, Underdog is the truest friend of the Underworld.
God, I love that sound. Get them F-18 jet noise. And we're back, baby. Let's look at the overall makeup of week 1. We're going to start by looking at some game lines and some game totals for week 1. And as I'm scrolling, Panthers at Falcons, game total of 42.5. Texans and Ravens, game total of 44 and 44.5. Bengals and Browns, 47.5. Jaguars at Colts, 43.5. Buccaneers Vikings, 45.5. Titans Saints lowly at 41. 49ers Steelers even lower, 40.5. Cardinals Commanders continuing the trend, 40. Packers Bears, 44.5. Raiders Broncos, 44.5. Now we're talking Dolphins Chargers, game total of 50 points. Patriots and Eagles, game total of 45. Rams Seahawks, okay, 47.5. Cowboys and Giants is not on the main slate. So what did you notice there? We have a whole lot of game totals that are in this mid-range. What I like to piece from this information, there are only 3 games with a game total of over 47 points. Why is this 47-point threshold important to us? This is a major betting cutoff is 47.0 points, where that is Vegas's kind of one of their gauges, one of their check valves, and one of their primary point values for game totals to indicate 1, uncertainty, and 2, the potential for a shootout. The other primary betting line value for a game total is 43.0 points. So when you see games that are won around those game totals of either 43.0 and 47.0, 1, there's ambiguity associated with those lines, as in they are very, very difficult to cross those thresholds. And 2, those are nice cutoffs to kind of get an opening idea of expected game environments in these games. And if we go back through these game totals, we only have the Bengals and Browns at 47.5. We have the Dolphins and Chargers at 50. And we've got the Rams and Seahawks at 47.5. Those are the only 3 games that have game totals over that significant threshold of 47.0 points. Now, again, why is that important to us as we're taking a look at initial opening Vegas lines and game totals? Well, that gives us a solid starting point from which we can start to gain an idea of where ownership is going to be going on a DFS slate. And as we just brought up, only the Dolphins and the Chargers have a game total that vastly exceeds that 47.0 threshold. What does that mean to us? We should expect significant ownership to be present from that game. That is probably going to be your quote unquote game of the week. That is going to be where you're going to see a lot of touts hammering the fact that we need to figure out how we can gain exposure to this game, the highest game total of the week. But if we start to really break down kind of what this means, we have 1, the Bengals and Browns, and we have 2, the Rams and the Seahawks that have game totals that are in that range. And we can expect significantly less overall combined ownership from those other 2 games. So just from a starting off, a baseline, how we're analyzing what we're seeing from game totals and how that kind of comes into play from a mindset perspective, we already know where a good chunk of ownership is going to be likely going. And we already know some viable game environment pivots from the get-go, from the jump. And we're talking, we are 3.5 weeks out from this slate being played. So good information to have. Now let's start to look at the actual player pricing. We're going to focus on the quarterbacks and we're going to focus on DraftKings pricing. Looking at the quarterbacks, and I've highlighted those 3 games to kind of drive home and hammer the point here. We've got Miami and Los Angeles, the top expected game environment. We've got the Rams and the Seahawks, and we've got Cincinnati and Cleveland selected here. Now let's look at some stuff right off the jump that kind of affects human psychology and a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about up to this point, but now transitioning from a best ball lens to a DFS lens. Right off the rip, Joe Burrow, a big fat red first in his opponent rank here next to his name. We also have some uncertainty, and this is going to be very, very interesting to track as we inch closer to week 1. We have some uncertainty here with Joe Burrow's status. Is he going to be healthy? We know he has that calf strain. Is he going to be healthy? 1, is he going to be affected? Is his mobility primarily going to be affected by that calf strain? What a calf strain, really, Joe Burrow is not a statue quarterback, but he's not a rushing quarterback. He has some level of escapability from the pocket, but that inside the pocket mobility is what is likeliest to be affected by his calf strain. And as we get more information, as week 1 inches closer here, we're going to get more information. We're going to see Joe Burrow's reps, and we could see him held out to start the year. So fairly wide range of outcomes as we're starting to analyze the slate, with Joe Burrow being one of the top expected quarterbacks as far as expected ownership goes. We see the player pricing here. Joe Burrow being the highest at the quarterback position of these 3 primary game environments. But below him, this is where things start to get interesting with Justin Herbert and Tua Tagovailoa. Justin Herbert, again, the human psychology aspect of having that bright green 30th next to his name for opponent rank over here, is likely going to influence expected ownership. And if we're talking about how much effect that is going to have, that simple fact that he's got that bright green 30th next to his name, it depends on the contest. It depends on the dollar amount of the buy-in. And DraftKings has an interesting setup for week 1 in that they have 3 different milli makers. So we'll focus kind of the discussion on those 3 contests. They have a $5 milli maker, they have a $100 milli maker, and they have their marquee event, the $4,444 buy-in milli maker as well. Each of those, the discussions on leverage, on human psychology, on ownership, on leverage. All those things are going to change depending on which contests we're talking about. But we're going to focus kind of our discussion on those three contests as we move forward. So Justin Herbert probably going to have the highest ownership in that low dollar contest in the $5 milli maker. Probably going to see that influenced differently as you start approaching the higher dollar buy-in amounts of the $100 and then even further the $4,000 plus buy-in milli maker. When we start to talk about thinking through the slate, how the different pieces interact, and how we gain leverage from that, and I want to preface this and make it extremely known. When we're talking about leverage, that does not mean like I am betting on Miami and the Chargers to completely fail and fall short. We know it's a good game environment. It's going to have ownership for a good reason. It is the likeliest game to exceed expectations, to be the quote unquote had to have it game. When we talk about had to have it type game environments, that is a game where you had to have a piece from it or you were not winning anything on that week. That does not happen even with a 50, like say we're at the end of the week for week one and Miami and the Chargers, they play to a 50-point game total. Is that a had to have it game environment? No. We're talking like 65 points total. We're talking 70 points are scored. A true shootout type game environment. Think back to week 2 of the 2022 season. We're talking Miami against Baltimore, where there's 70 plus points scored. And this is a game environment where you were not winning anything unless you had it. So the fact that Miami and the Dolphins, or sorry, the Dolphins and the Chargers game has the highest game total on the slate, but it's only 50 points. And I say only with quotations. The fact that it is only 50 points, that simply means that that is probably the likeliest game environment to far exceed expectations into this realm of had to have it. So now we're talking about the discussion of projected ownership versus the chances of that game developing into a had to have it game. And there's many different outcomes on the array of that range of outcomes. So we can't necessarily dive deep into those discussions as we sit right now because we're still 3.5 weeks until these games are being played. But we can start to kind of tailor our mindset to how we're seeing this slate and how we're expecting the field to see this slate. And as things sit now, we can fully expect Justin Herbert and Tua Tagovailoa to be two of the highest owned quarterbacks on this slate. What is interesting is we have these other two game environments, and we have some quarterbacks from those game environments that are extremely cheap, relatively speaking, compared to Burrow, Herbert, and Tua. First of all, Geno Smith and Deshaun Watson are both in this around $6,000 pricing range. And when you think about salary allocation per position, typically what you are getting at higher salary is a more condensed median projection, meaning that we have a safer floor. But that doesn't necessarily mean that there aren't quarterbacks who are priced cheap that cannot have a single week range of outcomes that includes an elevated ceiling. And what is most interesting in that discussion from these three top expected game environments are these bottom three quarterbacks here in Geno Smith, Deshaun Watson, and Matthew Stafford. So we look at the difference of 3 points in a game total, and that is very, very minimal when you think about how those points are being scored. But when you compare that to the chances of those respective game environments to vastly exceeding their expectation, which we can look at game totals for a game as the median projection for that game. Vegas is setting lines. They want to get exactly half of the action below that on the under, and they want to get exactly half the action on the over. They take the rake and now they move on. They're not trying to beat the market. They're trying to get as close to even money on one side of a line as they get on the other. So if we take that at face value and think about what that represents these are median projections. They want to half of the time have the outcome be on the under, and half the time they want the outcome to be on the over. So that is why Vegas is incentivized to make these game totals as accurate as possible when the lines are released. Obviously, things like market influence and money on one side versus the other are going to move those lines because now Vegas is playing catch up. They have to catch up and influence and move the line to get as close to even money on one side versus the other. So that is why utilizing Vegas game totals is important to our process here and to what we're trying to kind of glean from this initial look at player pricing. So that 3-point difference between the Rams and Seahawks and the Bengals and Browns versus or compared to the Dolphins and Chargers is very, very minimal from a real world outcome, but it is meaningful from what Vegas is trying to tell us in the chances of it developing into a game environment that you had to have. So what does that mean to us from a DFS perspective? That means that yes, Miami and Los Angeles Chargers, that game environment has the best chance to develop into a had to have it type game environment, but that does not necessarily mean that we're always going to see that game end as the highest scoring game on a given week. So putting an entire a full slate like this with 11 plus games, we'll say, is a full slate. So somewhere typically between 11 and 13 games is a full slate. So even if we say it's a 12 game slate, we'll take the mean of that. If it's a 12 game slate, the average chances of a game developing into the had to have a game, assuming every game had the same game total, would be 8.33%. So what Vegas lines are telling us is Miami and the Chargers have greater than an 8.33% chance of being the game that develops into a had to have it game on that week. Does that necessarily, or do we know what the actual percentage is? Is it 15%? Is it double that? Is it 16.66%? We have no idea. But what these lines are telling us is this game environment has the best chance of the 11 or 12 or 13 games that are on a main slate of developing into that game environment. The follow-on, like thinking through this logically, we're not always going to have a game on a given slate that develops into a had to have it quote unquote game environment. There's not always going to be a game that vastly outperforms its expectation. So while this is important to us and while we need to be thinking about these things, it is not the only thing that goes into our decision-making process. We do not need to account for and make sure that every roster we're putting into play in week one accounts for all three of these games. They are just simply a starting point, but it is important to understand kind of what those values are telling us. So when we're looking at these bottom three teams, what we're seeing is kind of interesting in the sense that two quarterbacks are from the same game in these three top expected game environments on week one slate: Geno Smith and Matthew Stafford. Sitting here 4 weeks prior to this slate being played, who can we expect to garner the most ownership of those two? It's Geno Smith, the favorites in that game, and the off-season buzz that we're getting around the Rams is that this team is going to be absolute garbage. But when we look at the Rams in particular, Matthew Stafford at 5.7 in salary is extremely appealing from both one, a leverage perspective, and two, not sacrificing the median projection that some of these other top quarterbacks have on this slate. So that was a quick down and dirty of the top three expected game environments. Let's look at the rest of the quarterback market on this slate and kind of get some overall ideas of one, where's ownership expected to go to? Two, where can we target some game environments through these quarterbacks? Because talking about the quarterbacks first is also in effect talking about our primary game stacks, because as we know through DFS theory, we're going to want to be pairing pass catchers with the quarterbacks that we're playing. We're also going to want to be thinking about player combinations and correlation, which are, in a DFS centric sense, simply bringbacks from the other side of that game. So the top overall priced quarterbacks here, we have three that are kind of head and shoulders above the rest of the field. We have Lamar Jackson playing Houston, we have Jalen Hurts playing New England, and we have Justin Fields playing Green Bay. If we look at all of those game totals, all of those game totals were in the low, so sub 43.0, to medium, between 43.0 and 47.0. All three of those quarterbacks are from that game environment. Because the psychological aspects of player pricing in week one is notoriously loose, as in we are not as strapped for salary as we're going to be once we start getting into weeks 4, 5, and beyond. So because that is the case, the psychological aspects of having loose pricing means that the field is going to feel like they have additional salary to spend. So that is naturally going to lead to a bump to ownership on the high-priced players at the quarterback position. People are feeling like, I have all this salary. Where am I going to spend it? I'm going to spend it on the safety that these quarterbacks are giving us. And as we see, all of Lamar Jackson, Jalen Hurts, and Justin Fields all are those rushing quarterbacks with pass game upside. So all of that taken together, taking the human psychology aspects of it, taking the kind of general field assumptions that we've picked up over the previous 4 or 5 seasons, we know that these guys are likely to garner some significant ownership. That said, what are we paying for salary? Higher price means generally a higher floor. So are either of these three game environments likely to develop into a kind of had to have it game through their game totals? Is Houston likely to push Baltimore? Is New England likely to push Philadelphia? We have no idea what to expect from Green Bay, right? There's all kinds of uncertainty there. The point there being is these three quarterbacks, while they carry a significantly higher floor than the rest of the field, are equally as unlikely to provide a score that you had to have it and you could not win without. So pair that with the idea that they are likely to be some of the highest owned quarterbacks on this slate. Now we start to get to the idea of leverage, and how do we leverage that truth? Well, it leads to an expected underweight position for these top three. I'm not sitting here saying don't play just Lamar Jackson, Jalen Hurts, and Justin Fields. I'm saying we need to be thinking about the second, third, fourth layers of kind of what the pricing is telling us and what we can expect the field to be doing. The next two quarterbacks are quarterbacks that we've already talked about in 2 of the top 3 expected game environments. Sorry, the next 3 quarterbacks all the way down to Tua. When we get down to Trevor Lawrence, the quarterback position pricing is very interesting from the sense that players are considered priced up or paying up at the position typically around the 7K range. So the mere fact that we've got Herbert and Tua here at 6.9 and 6.7 from the top expected game environment, the fact that it is the top expected game environment kind of lumps them into these pay up players here in Jalen Hurts, Justin Fields, and Lamar Jackson. So we can expect the top 5 quarterbacks in player pricing to garner some significant ownership on this slate. And when I say significant ownership, typically ownership at the quarterback position is rather flat, in that we typically don't see these outliers where one quarterback is going to be 25, 30% owned. Because we only play one of them, it's a onesie position, and typically on a generalized statement, scoring at the quarterback position is more tightly about its mean, as in there's less standard deviations. Typically, we see player outcomes more tightly compacted about a median projection. And so that kind of leads to this flatter scoring position. All of that immediately kind of makes me think, how can we be different on this slate? Is it increasingly likely that one of these top 5 quarterbacks puts up a score that you had to have it? Over to interpretation, but my initial read on the situation is probably not. There's probably going to be players in these mid to sub mid, these low priced range at the quarterback position that puts up a score that matches some of the outputs of these top price quarterbacks. And when that is the case, we have a lot to think about from a salary allocation standpoint, and what you're paying for and what paying down at the quarterback position opens up on the rest of your roster. So there's guys like Cooper Kupp are on the slate. There's guys like Devontae Adams, Tyreek Hill, these high-priced wide receivers where the range of outcomes is more widely dispersed about a wider array, meaning more variance, meaning typically higher ceiling, higher spike week potential. So that's a lot to think about from a theoretical standpoint. Real quick, we're going to take a pause. If you like what you're hearing, check us out at oneweekseason.com. All of my work is housed over there from a DFS perspective. Find me over there, get some deeper thoughts into the slate as we get closer to the season. Check out oneweekseason.com. Use promo code HILO for any of the products that we have over there. That will get you 20% off any of the products and subscriptions that we have at 1 Week Season. So continuing to this mid-range, typically what you get from mid-range player pricing at the quarterback position is you get an interesting mix of solid floor and upside potential. But when you get to this mid-price quarterback pricing at the quarterback position, typically these players are coming in at much lower ownership. So this is typically the range where you're looking to generate significant leverage when you're building rosters. The problem with that in week 1, like we talked about, is player pricing is so loose that we're typically going to see, one, even less ownership on these players in this range, and two, less of a need for players to feel like they need to go below this range. So that's extremely important when you start thinking about how rosters are coming together, because players, the psychological aspect here is, I'm going to get different by coming down below the top tier in player pricing to this mid range. And this is typically where we see the field is going to settle at an increased rate in week 1 because player pricing is so loose. So that immediately brings me down to wanting to focus my attention on seeing if there's anyone in this sub 6K range. Like I said, medium player pricing for quarterbacks, typically in that 6K to 7K range. Scrolling down here, we get to some gross names, but we've got some potential. Russell Wilson coming off a career low year in touchdowns, in efficiency, in pass yards, all these metrics. But again, what's changed in Denver? A whole heck of a lot. Interesting, because Las Vegas has been notoriously soft in the secondary. They've done some things to address that, but this is a team where if they play a team with an offensive line that can hold up in pass protection, has been one to attack. Whether or not Denver's offensive line can hold up in pass protection is the question of week 1 here. Kyler Murray, highly likely to miss week 1, but if he does play, we are likely to see the game total in the Arizona and Washington game increase, but we'll bypass that discussion for now. Getting to Matthew Stafford. Matthew Stafford is another quarterback that has a lot of negative biases against him as we currently sit. Similar to Russell Wilson, the Rams struggled mightily last season. They fought through injuries to Matthew Stafford. They fought through injuries to Cooper Kupp. We had other members of this offense that were banged up throughout the season. Van Jefferson was coming off of a lost year, and he really wasn't producing or wasn't himself until the midway point in the season. So there's a lot of negative influence and negative biases associated with the Rams for week 1 or early in the season. What I'm looking to do early in the season is we're kind of in I call it the I know better than you window. We don't have a lot of information about how teams are going to run because of the significant changes that haven't happened within an NFL franchise from year to year. It is a high turnover rate professional sport, more so than a lot of other sports professionally in the United States. So what we have in this early window is heavy biases, and we're in this kind of I know better than you phase where we don't have the data yet to make accurate projections. We don't have the data yet to know kind of how an offense is going to look. So when that's the case, and we see a team like the Rams, where they have the pieces to do some damage on the scoreboard, but we know that this team is going to garner lower ownership than they otherwise probably should in this spot, that leads to a situation where I'm immediately attracted to it because we can take advantage of the negative biases that are associated with them and leverage that into a low-owned play that still carries significant upside. Reinforcing that fact for week 1 is the fact that this game is one of the top 3 in game totals, so one of the top 3 expected game environments. So that immediately leads me to Matthew Stafford as a great potential pivot for week 1 from a leverage standpoint and not sacrificing the ceiling that we're going to need to take down tournaments. Right below him, Anthony Richardson at 5.6 in salary in a game against Jacksonville, where we know Jacksonville, they have an offense that's going to put up points this season, but they also have a defense that is going to more or less suppress points above league average. So they have an above average defense as well. But with a guy like Anthony Richardson, we look at his archetype, his athletic profile. He is similar in archetype and similar in nature to the top 3 quarterbacks that are on the slate in Lamar Jackson, Jalen Hurts, and Justin Fields. He brings a downfield capability. He brings a mobility aspect, and he's a guy who legitimately could rush for 2 touchdowns on a given week. What we're likely to see early in the season is his ownership is not going to match that upside because humans, like we've talked about in the psychological explorations, we're creatures of comfort. We like to know, we like to see it before we believe it. So with a guy like Anthony Richardson, as things stand now, because he's low priced, because player pricing in week 1 is so loose, we're likely to see suppressed ownership on Anthony Richardson. He brings an immense upside, particularly at this price of 5.6. So another guy that I'm highlighting early to join Matthew Stafford as guys priced low that can match the output of those high-priced guys. When you start getting down below those two, starting to get to Bryce Young, CJ Stroud, these rookie quarterbacks, starting to get to Brock Purdy, who we know carries a fairly solid median projection week in and week out, but highly unlikely to put up this had-to-have-it score that you cannot win without. Derek Carr, similar story. Derek Carr is interesting because he's playing a Tennessee defense who, 1, sells out to stop the run, and 2, does not have the pieces in the secondary to slow down opponents passing deep. We saw it in preseason week 1. This team struggled with containing opposing wide receivers in one-on-one and zone coverage. So Derek Carr is an interesting one, priced down at 5.3. Again, leveraging the uncertainty associated with the New Orleans Saints and parlaying that into this idea that we might be able to match the quarterback production from the top 5 at the position at a much lower cost because of the overall composition and makeup of this slate. In that same game, Ryan Tannehill, another guy that has been largely left for dead because of these negative biases associated with Tennessee. But what happened in Tennessee? They went out and signed DeAndre Hopkins. Ryan Tannehill is a guy that had 7 rushing touchdowns in each of his last 2 full healthy seasons. So this is a guy that brings an elevated floor when you compare him to others that are priced around him, and you get the potential for upside if their game environment is pushed. Typically, the Titans are not going to be the driving force by pushing a game environment. They're not going to be playing at a high pace. They're not going to be attacking downfield relentlessly, but they are a team that is plenty fine in following suit. So if you're looking for a guy like Ryan Tannehill, you want to, 1, have him stacked or double stacked, and you 2, absolutely must have a bring back from the other side, because it is typically the other side of their games that is the driving force in turning their game environment into something that you had to have. The other guys down here, they really don't have the ability within their range of outcomes for a single game to match the top guys. But now we're in the realm of, from a DFS theory perspective, if you're not able to match the high price players, now you're trying to get a comparable point per dollar output to free up salary that you can allocate at other areas. The problem with that thinking in week 1 is, as we've talked about, player pricing is rather soft, meaning that we kind of feel like we're working with 55K or 60K in salary instead of the standard 50K. When that's the case, it is highly unlikely that these other quarterbacks that are priced down here that don't carry the same single game ceiling in their range of outcomes, it is highly unlikely that one of them is going to be optimal on a week like this. So early on in the season, we want to be hunting upside as much as possible. So if I'm looking at these sub elites at the quarterback position, as far as range of outcomes, as far as player pricing, I want to be focusing on the guys that can legitimately put up top overall or top 3 raw points totals at the position. So for me, for week 1, that's Matthew Stafford, that's Anthony Richardson, that's maybe Derek Carr, and that's maybe Ryan Tannehill. Everyone else kind of falls short. So that kind of affects and influences my player pool going in from a theoretical and conceptual starting point to confining it to the top 5 at the position. And then these guys down here that can alter my roster construction from a salary allocation standpoint, but still give me the requisite ceiling to be able to compete from a raw point total standpoint. So my player pool, if the slate locked tomorrow, my player pool at quarterback for week 1 would be Lamar Jackson, Jalen Hurts, Justin Fields, Joe Burrow, Justin Herbert, Matthew Stafford, Anthony Richardson, and maybe Derek Carr and Ryan Tannehill. So that was a lot. From here on out, we're going to try and get some guests on so you don't just hear me talking and yammering for 45 minutes, and get some guests and some help so I can take a breather. And we're going to hear from some awesome DFS minds as we do that. So with that, we are going to get out of here with one final note from the Podfather.
Hey, I want to take a moment to thank you for tuning in. It's important to me that all of our media be free. This is only possible because of you, allowing a true independent sports media enterprise to thrive unlike any other in the business. So please subscribe to the All In Package to continue to make all of this possible, to ensure that all of our stats, information, data, content is available to you, especially you, the people that get the site and get the show.